The hospital cafeteria worker who wasn't. They mocked the cafeteria worker when she quietly corrected the pediatric surgeon's diagnosis. Stick to serving soup, the doctor sneered. But when the 8-year-old patient flatlined and she performed an impossible heart procedure with nothing but kitchen utensils, the entire surgical team realized their mistake. What happened next revealed a secret that had been hidden for 12 years. Welcome to Hidden Valor Stories. Before we dive into how a lunch lady became the hospital's most mysterious surgeon, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe that extraordinary people often hide in the most ordinary places, hit that subscribe button. These hidden stories of courage need to be told. Children's Medical Center buzzed with its usual controlled chaos at 11:30 a.m. as Isabella Rodriguez wheeled her food cart through the pediatric wing. To the doctors rushing past her in designer scrubs, she was simply Bella, the quiet cafeteria worker who'd been serving lunch for 3 years without causing any trouble. She moved through the corridors with practiced invisibility, her graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her faded uniform marking her as someone the medical staff rarely noticed unless they needed coffee refilled. At 45, Isabella had perfected the art of being overlooked, keeping her eyes down and her voice soft whenever doctors spoke around her as if she weren't there. But what they didn't see was how her eyes tracked every detail of their conversations. When Dr. Peterson discussed a complex case while grabbing his sandwich, Isabella listened with the intensity of someone who understood exactly what he was describing. When nurses debated medication dosages at the lunch table, she mentally corrected their calculations with precision that would have surprised them. Her English was deliberately simple in public, enough to take orders and confirm deliveries, but she absorbed every medical term, every procedural detail, every diagnostic discussion that happened around her invisible presence. In the margins of discarded medical journals she found in the break room trash, Isabella wrote notes in Spanish that revealed a depth of knowledge that would have shocked the staff who saw her as just another service worker. The truth was that Dr. Isabella Rodriguez had once been considered one of the most brilliant pediatric cardiac surgeons in South America. Her hands, now hidden under latex gloves while serving mac and cheese, had once performed procedures that saved hundreds of children's lives. Her mind, dismissed by doctors who assumed she couldn't understand their medical discussions, held knowledge that could have revolutionized their approach to complex cases. But 12 years ago, everything changed when she discovered that the respected hospital administrator in Bogotá where she worked was allowing cartel members to receive priority treatment in exchange for protection money. Her attempt to report the corruption had been turned against her when 3 patients died during routine surgeries, deaths that forensic evidence later suggested were caused by tampered equipment rather than surgical error. The medical board, influenced by the same administrator she'd tried to expose, had stripped her license and opened criminal investigations that forced her to flee Colombia with her 2 young children. The woman who had once been featured on the cover of International Pediatric Surgery Journal was now hiding in a hospital cafeteria, serving food to doctors who had no idea they were dismissing one of the world's most skilled cardiac surgeons. Isabella's daily routine was designed to maintain her invisibility while staying close to the work that had once defined her purpose. She timed her deliveries to observe surgeries through the windows of operating rooms, watching techniques evolve and mentally critiquing procedures with the eye of someone who had trained the surgeons, now teaching these methods. Her apartment near the hospital was filled with medical textbooks ordered under different names, research papers downloaded from international journals, and detailed notes tracking the latest advances in pediatric cardiac surgery. She maintained her knowledge not out of hope that she could return to surgery, but because medicine was too deeply embedded in her identity to abandon completely. Every morning, Isabella looked at the photo she kept hidden in her locker, herself in surgical scrubs, holding her daughter Maria after successfully repairing the child's heart defect when she was just 6 months old. It reminded her why she had become a surgeon and why her exile felt like a death sentence that she served one lunch tray at a time. Dr. James Matthews was having the kind of morning that reminded him why pediatric surgery required more than just technical skill. The 28-year-old surgeon had completed his residency at Johns Hopkins with outstanding evaluations, but 3 months into his position at Children's Medical Center, he was learning that real-world surgical challenges often exceeded textbook scenarios. His current case was exactly the kind of complex problem that made him wish the hospital's senior cardiac surgeon wasn't tied up in emergency surgery with a trauma case that had been ongoing for 6 hours. 8-year-old Emma Chen had been born with a rare combination of heart defects that required precise surgical repair, but the approach he'd planned based on standard protocols wasn't addressing the unique anatomy revealed by her imaging studies. Matthews studied the echocardiogram results while grabbing lunch from the cafeteria line, his mind racing through possible modifications to his surgical approach. The standard procedure called for rerouting blood flow through a specific pathway, but Emma's condition included complications that weren't adequately addressed in the literature he'd reviewed. As he muttered to himself about the unusual positioning of Emma's pulmonary arteries, Isabella appeared beside him to refill his coffee cup. What she said next would have shocked him if he'd been paying attention to who was speaking. "Doctor, forgive me for listening, but that sounds like heterotaxy syndrome with interrupted inferior vena cava," Isabella said quietly in accented English. "The standard Fontan approach won't work with that anatomy." Matthews looked up, surprised that anyone had been following his medical reasoning. He saw only the cafeteria worker who served his lunch every day, someone he'd never imagined could understand complex cardiac terminology. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" he asked, more confused than annoyed. Isabella's eyes dropped immediately, her demeanor shifting back to the submissive service worker role she'd perfected. "Nothing, doctor. I heard you mention heart surgery. My cousin had similar problem in Mexico." Matthews studied her face for a moment, noting something in her expression that didn't match her simple explanation. But his phone buzzed with a message from the surgical coordinator, and the moment passed as he hurried back to his case preparation. What Matthews didn't know was that Isabella had spent the previous evening researching Emma's exact condition after overhearing the initial consultation between Dr. Matthews and the child's parents. She had recognized the symptoms immediately as a combination she had successfully treated multiple times during her years in Bogotá, including 2 cases that had been published in international medical journals under her name. Isabella had watched Matthews struggle with the case planning through the cafeteria's service window, seeing him apply standard protocols to a situation that required innovative adaptation. Her suggestion about the Fontan approach was based on hard-earned experience with complications that most surgeons encountered only in theoretical training scenarios. The truth was that Emma's condition fell into a category of cases that Isabella had essentially pioneered the treatment for during her research fellowship at the Hospital de Cardiología in Mexico City. She had developed a modified surgical technique that addressed the specific blood flow problems created by interrupted vena cava in pediatric patients, a procedure that had been adopted by cardiac centers across Latin America but hadn't yet reached mainstream practice in U.S. hospitals. But revealing that knowledge would have required explaining how a cafeteria worker possessed expertise that exceeded what most attending physicians could provide. Isabella had learned through 12 years of hiding that survival meant keeping her medical knowledge invisible, even when she watched doctors struggle with cases she could have solved. As Matthews returned to his office to review surgical options, Isabella continued her lunch service with the practiced calm of someone who had learned to carry life-saving knowledge in silence. She served soup to nurses who discussed Emma's case with concern, knowing that the child's survival depended on surgical decisions that were being made without access to the expertise standing 3 feet away with a ladle in her hand. The irony wasn't lost on her that the hospital had hired one of the world's leading experts on pediatric cardiac anomalies to serve sandwiches while their surgical team struggled with a case that fell squarely within her area of specialization. But revealing her identity would mean risking the safety of her children, who were finally stable in their new lives after years of living in fear. Isabella's choice was the same one she faced every day: watch from the shadows while patients received suboptimal care, or risk everything to provide the expertise that could save lives. Until now, she had always chosen silence. At 2:15 p.m., Emma Chen was wheeled into operating room 3 for what Dr. Matthews hoped would be a routine cardiac repair, despite the unusual complications he'd identified. The 8-year-old's parents waited in the family conference room, trusting that their daughter's surgery would proceed smoothly under the care of doctors they assumed were the most qualified available. Matthews had spent the previous 2 hours reviewing every relevant case study he could locate, consulting with colleagues via video call, and modifying his surgical approach to address Emma's unique anatomy. His plan involved a complex rerouting of blood flow that would theoretically resolve her condition, but he remained uncomfortable with aspects of the procedure that fell outside his direct experience. The surgical team included Dr. Sarah Kim, an experienced pediatric anesthesiologist, Nurse Patricia Williams, who had assisted with more cardiac repairs than any other OR nurse at the hospital, and Dr. Marcus Torres, a cardiology fellow who would provide additional hands during critical portions of the operation. As the team completed their preparation, Matthews felt the familiar surge of focus that accompanied complex surgeries. His training had prepared him for challenging cases, and he had successfully completed similar procedures during his residency. Emma's condition was more complex than usual, but the fundamental repair principles remained the same. Isabella had timed her afternoon supply delivery to coincide with the surgery, wheeling her cart past OR3 just as the team was beginning their initial incisions. Through the observation window, she could see Matthews working with careful precision, his movements betraying the slight hesitation of someone operating at the edge of his comfort zone. What Isabella saw in those first moments confirmed her earlier assessment. Matthews was applying the correct general approach but making subtle positioning errors that would create complications later in the procedure. His incision placement was textbook accurate but didn't account for the specific anatomical variations that Emma's condition presented. As Matthews began the delicate work of accessing Emma's heart, Isabella found herself unconsciously holding her breath. She recognized the exact moment when he encountered the arterial positioning that his imaging studies had failed to fully reveal, the slight pause in his movements, the way he leaned closer to examine structures that didn't match his expectations. Through the OR window, Isabella watched Dr. Matthews make a critical error that would kill Emma within minutes, if not immediately corrected. But when she tried to enter the operating room to warn them, what happened next revealed the truth that had been hidden for 12 years. Isabella pushed through the OR doors without thinking, her years of surgical instinct overriding the caution that had kept her identity hidden. "Doctor, you need to stop," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to life-or-death command situations. Matthews looked up from his work, startled by the interruption. "What are you doing in here? This is a sterile environment." "You're placing the conduit in the wrong position," Isabella said, her accent disappearing as adrenaline took over. "With her interrupted IVC, that placement will create a flow obstruction that will be fatal." Dr. Torres moved to escort Isabella from the room. "Ma'am, you need to leave immediately. This is a surgical procedure." But Isabella's eyes were locked on Matthews, and something in her expression made him pause. She wasn't speaking like a confused cafeteria worker who had wandered into the wrong room. Her terminology was precise, her assessment specific, and her urgency genuine. "How could you possibly know that?" Matthews asked, his hands frozen over Emma's open chest. Isabella's mind raced through her options. Revealing her identity would end the life she had built for her children, potentially putting them in danger if word reached the wrong people in Colombia. But Emma was dying on the table, and Matthews was about to make an error that would ensure her death. "Because I've repaired this exact condition 17 times, Isabella said quietly, "and if you continue with that approach, this child will not survive the next 10 minutes. The OR fell silent except for the steady beeping of monitoring equipment. Matthews stared at the woman who served his lunch every day, trying to reconcile her calm surgical assessment with everything he thought he knew about her. Emma's vital signs began showing the first indicators of cardiovascular stress as Matthews hesitated over the surgical decision that could determine whether the 8-year-old lived or died. Her oxygen saturation dropped slightly, and the cardiac monitors reflected the strain that her malformed heart was experiencing during the complex repair procedure. Dr. Kim, monitoring anesthesia and vital functions, looked up with concern. "Dr. Matthews, we're seeing some instability. Whatever we're going to do, we need to decide quickly." Matthews found himself facing a situation that his medical training had never prepared him for. The woman standing beside his operating table was claiming surgical expertise that, if genuine, exceeded his own experience with this particular condition. But she was also someone he had never seen in scrubs, whose credentials were unknown, and whose presence violated every protocol for sterile surgical environments. "I don't know who you are," Matthews said carefully, "but unless you can prove you have surgical authority, I need you to leave this OR immediately." Isabella looked at Emma's open chest, seeing the anatomical landmarks that confirmed everything she had predicted about the case's complexity. The child's interrupted inferior vena cava was positioned exactly where Isabella had expected, creating blood flow patterns that required surgical techniques that weren't taught in standard cardiac training programs. "My name is Dr. Isabella Rodriguez," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had commanded operating rooms for 15 years. "I trained at Universidad Nacional de Colombia, completed my pediatric cardiac fellowship at Hospital de Cardiología in Mexico City, and published the definitive research on surgical repair of heterotaxy syndrome with interrupted IVC." Matthews paused, recognition flickering in his eyes. "Rodriguez, I remember that research. But that surgeon disappeared years ago after some kind of scandal. The scandal was fabricated, Isabella said simply. The research was real, and right now, Emma needs someone who understands how to repair her condition before irreversible damage occurs. Dr. Torres stepped forward with security concerns that overrode medical considerations. Even if that's true, you don't have privileges at this hospital. You can't legally participate in surgery. Isabella's eyes moved between Emma's vulnerable form and the monitors showing increasing cardiovascular stress. In 30 seconds, her systemic circulation is going to fail because the approach you're using doesn't accommodate her anatomy. I can guide Dr. Matthews through the correct repair, or I can watch her die while we debate hospital credentials. Matthews felt the weight of an impossible decision. His training told him to follow protocols and remove the unauthorized person from his OR. His instincts, however, were telling him that Isabella possessed knowledge that could save Emma's life. The confidence in her voice, the precision of her terminology, and her accurate prediction of surgical complications suggested expertise that he desperately needed. Emma's monitors began alarming as her blood pressure dropped and cardiac output became insufficient to maintain stable circulation. Dr. Kim's voice carried new urgency. "Dr. Matthews, she's decompensating. We need to do something now." "What exactly are you suggesting?" Matthews asked. Isabella, his hands poised over instruments while Emma's life hung in the balance. "Let me scrub in and assist you," Isabella said. "I'll guide you through the modified technique, but you maintain primary surgeon responsibility. The repair requires repositioning the conduit to accommodate her interrupted IVC while creating an alternative pathway for systemic venous return." Matthews looked at his team, seeing the same desperate calculation in their eyes that he felt in his own mind. Emma was dying, and conventional approaches weren't working. The woman claiming to be Dr. Rodriguez was either an expert who could save the child's life or an imposter whose interference would ensure Emma's death. "If you're wrong about this," Matthews said quietly, "Emma dies." "If I'm right and you don't let me help," Isabella replied, "Emma dies anyway." Matthews made the decision that would either save Emma's life or end his medical career. "Dr. Kim, get her scrubbed in, fast." Isabella moved with practiced efficiency toward the scrub station, her movements betraying the muscle memory of someone who had prepared for countless surgical procedures. As she began the ritual of surgical preparation, her hands moved with the automatic precision of someone for whom scrubbing had been routine for decades. Dr. Torres watched through the OR window as Isabella transformed from cafeteria worker to surgical team member. Her posture changed as she donned surgical attire, gaining the bearing and confidence of someone stepping back into their natural environment. When she entered the OR in full surgical gear, even her facial expression had shifted to reflect the focused intensity that defined elite surgeons. "Talk me through what you're seeing," Isabella said to Matthews as she positioned herself across from him at the operating table. Matthews described his findings and the complications he'd encountered, using technical terminology that Isabella followed with ease. Her questions revealed an understanding of cardiac anatomy that impressed even Dr. Kim, whose anesthesiology training had provided extensive exposure to various surgical approaches. "The problem is here," Isabella said, indicating the area where Matthews had planned to place the conduit. "You're following the standard protocol, but Emma's interrupted IVC creates a unique circulation pattern that requires modification of the typical repair sequence." She guided Matthews through a repositioning technique that involved creating an alternative pathway for blood return while maintaining the primary repair objectives. Her instructions were specific, confident, and demonstrated familiarity with anatomical variations that most surgeons would encounter only rarely. "Now we need to create a fenestration here," Isabella continued, indicating a position that wasn't part of Matthews' original plan. "This will provide pressure relief during the transition period while her circulation adapts to the repair." Matthews followed her guidance with growing amazement at the precision of her surgical knowledge. Every suggestion Isabella made addressed specific complications that he had identified but didn't know how to resolve. Her approach demonstrated not just theoretical understanding but practical experience with the exact challenges that Emma's condition presented. As the repair progressed, Emma's vital signs began stabilizing in ways that exceeded Matthews' expectations. The innovative techniques that Isabella was guiding him through were clearly having positive effects on cardiac function and circulation that conventional approaches hadn't achieved. "Suture placement needs to account for growth potential," Isabella said, directing Matthews through delicate positioning that would accommodate Emma's continued cardiac development. Children with this condition often require revision surgery if the initial repair doesn't anticipate anatomical changes. Dr. Kim monitored the anesthesia while observing surgical techniques that she had never seen before. Isabella's approach combined standard cardiac repair principles with innovations that addressed the specific challenges of Emma's condition. Her surgical knowledge appeared to extend beyond what most attending physicians could provide. The most remarkable aspect of Isabella's guidance was how naturally she seemed to anticipate each stage of the procedure. Her suggestions preceded complications that Matthews would have encountered, suggesting experience with cases that had taught her exactly what problems to expect and how to prevent them. Final anastomosis should be positioned here, Isabella said, indicating placement that differed from standard protocols but clearly addressed Emma's unique anatomy. This will provide optimal flow characteristics while minimizing turbulence that could lead to thrombosis. As Matthews completed the repair under Isabella's guidance, Emma's monitors showed cardiac function that exceeded what anyone on the surgical team had expected. Her circulation stabilized at levels that suggested the repair had not only addressed her immediate condition, but had optimized her cardiac function beyond what standard procedures typically achieved. Dr. Torres, who had observed the entire procedure through the OR window, entered as the team prepared to close Emma's chest. "I've never seen anything like that technique," he said to Isabella. "Where did you learn to approach heterotaxy syndrome that way?" Isabella met his eyes with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned the right to surgical innovation through years of experience with complex cases. "I developed that approach after treating 43 children with similar conditions." Emma makes 44. As Emma was transferred to post-surgical recovery with vital signs that indicated a successful repair, Matthews faced Isabella in the OR's aftermath with questions that had been building throughout the procedure. Her surgical knowledge had exceeded his own experience, and her techniques had demonstrated familiarity with cardiac conditions that most surgeons encountered only in medical literature. "I need to know who you really are," Matthews said as the surgical team completed their documentation. "What I just witnessed wasn't possible unless you have extensive experience with pediatric cardiac surgery." Isabella removed her surgical cap, revealing the graying hair that had been hidden beneath the cafeteria hairnet for 3 years. Without the submissive posture and careful English that had defined her service worker persona, she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to life or death decision-making. "Dr. Isabella Maria Rodriguez," she said, her accent returning, but her English now fluent and precise, graduated Universidad Nacional de Colombia, Pediatric Cardiac Surgery Fellowship, Hospital de Cardiología, Mexico City, 2003, Department Head, Hospital San Carlos, Bogotá, 2008 to 2012. Dr. Kim pulled up medical databases on her tablet, searching for verification of Isabella's credentials. "Dr. Rodriguez, here it is, published extensively on heterotaxy syndrome repair techniques, credited with innovative approaches to complex congenital heart conditions, but the records show she left practice 12 years ago." "I didn't leave practice," Isabella said quietly. "I fled Colombia after discovering corruption that led to patient deaths being blamed on my surgical techniques. The hospital administrator was taking cartel money and allowing their members priority treatment, which resulted in equipment tampering that killed 3 of my patients." Matthews listened with growing understanding as Isabella described her exile from medicine. "The medical board investigation was compromised from the beginning. Evidence that would have proven the equipment sabotage was suppressed, and I faced criminal charges for murders I didn't commit. My choice was prison or exile." Dr. Torres researched Isabella's background while she spoke, finding news articles from Colombian medical journals that supported her account. There are references here to an investigation that was later questioned for procedural irregularities. International medical organizations expressed concern about the handling of her case. "I've been living under an assumed identity for 12 years, Isabella continued. "Working at this hospital allowed me to stay close to medicine while keeping my children safe from people who wanted to silence me permanently." Matthews struggled to reconcile the confident surgeon who had just saved Emma's life with the quiet cafeteria worker who had served his lunch every day for 3 years. "Why didn't you ever say anything? The hospital could have used your expertise." "Because revealing my identity would have meant exposing my children to danger," Isabella said. "Maria is 19 now, studying pre-med at UC Davis. Carlos is 16 and wants to be an engineer. They've finally built lives where they don't have to look over their shoulders constantly." Dr. Kim found additional information that supported Isabella's claims. The research she published is still being cited in current medical literature. Her techniques for complex cardiac repairs have been adopted by pediatric centers worldwide. Emma's surgery today used methods that you developed? Matthews asked. Isabella nodded. The fenestration technique and modified conduit placement were approaches I pioneered after treating dozens of children with heterotaxy syndrome. The standard protocols work for typical cases, but complex anatomical variations require adaptation that most surgeons never encounter. Dr. Torres looked up from his research with expression of someone processing an extraordinary discovery. Dr. Rodriguez, the medical literature credits you with reducing mortality rates for complex cardiac repairs by more than 40%. You're considered one of the leading innovators in pediatric cardiac surgery. I was, Isabella said. For 12 years I've been a cafeteria worker who watches other surgeons struggle with cases I could solve. Today was the first time I couldn't stay silent and watch a child die. Matthews realized the full magnitude of what had occurred. You've been hiding at this hospital for 3 years, watching us perform surgeries on conditions you specialize in, and never said anything? Until today, Isabella said, looking toward the recovery room where Emma was beginning to wake up with a successfully repaired heart. But some cases are worth the risk. Dr. Patricia Hayes, chief of pediatric surgery at Children's Medical Center, arrived at the hospital 30 minutes after receiving Dr. Matthews' urgent call about the extraordinary circumstances surrounding Emma Chen's successful surgery. Her review of the surgical notes and video recordings from OR3 revealed techniques that exceeded what she expected from her surgical staff. Dr. Matthews explained to me how you performed modifications to the Fontan procedure that I've never seen before. Dr. Hayes said as she studied the surgical documentation, these approaches aren't part of standard training. Matthews gestured toward Isabella, who remained in surgical attire pending the administrative review that would determine her immediate future. Dr. Hayes, I need to introduce you to Dr. Isabella Rodriguez, who guided me through the repair of Emma's condition. Dr. Hayes studied Isabella with the careful assessment of someone evaluating extraordinary claims. Dr. Rodriguez, I'm not familiar with your credentials at this hospital. How did you come to be assisting in a complex cardiac procedure? Because until this afternoon, she's been serving lunch in our cafeteria for 3 years, Dr. Matthews said. Dr. Hayes, we just watched a surgical technique that saved Emma's life, performed by someone who's been hiding her identity as one of the world's leading pediatric cardiac surgeons. Isabella provided Dr. Hayes with the same account she had given the surgical team, describing her exile from Colombia and the circumstances that had forced her to abandon her medical career. Dr. Hayes listened with the focused attention of someone processing information that challenged everything she understood about hospital staffing and surgical expertise. Dr. Rodriguez, I'm going to need to verify your credentials and review the circumstances that led to your departure from practice, Dr. Hayes said. But first I want to understand the surgical approach you used with Emma. Isabella described the technical modifications she had guided Matthews through, explaining the research that had led to her innovative approaches for treating heterotaxy syndrome. Her explanations demonstrated not just theoretical knowledge but practical experience with complications that arose during actual surgical procedures. Dr. Hayes pulled up medical databases and contacted colleagues at pediatric cardiac centers across North America to verify Isabella's credentials and reputation. The responses confirmed her extraordinary surgical background and expressed surprise that she had been located after years of being missing from the medical community. Dr. Rodriguez, your research is still being taught in pediatric cardiac surgery programs, Dr. Hayes said after reviewing the verification information. Medical centers have been trying to locate you for years to consult on complex cases. I've been here the entire time, Isabella said simply, serving sandwiches to surgeons who could have benefited from consulting on the cases I watched them struggle with. Dr. Hayes contacted legal counsel and hospital administration to review the extraordinary circumstances surrounding Isabella's involvement in Emma's surgery. The legal complications of her unlicensed participation in the procedure required careful handling, but Emma's successful outcome and Isabella's undeniable expertise created a unique situation. Dr. Rodriguez, the hospital is prepared to offer you a consulting position while we work through the process of credential verification and licensure reinstatement, Dr. Hayes said. Your expertise could benefit countless pediatric patients who need the kind of innovative surgical approaches you've developed. Isabella looked toward the recovery room where Emma was awakening with a heart that would allow her to live a normal life. Dr. Hayes, I appreciate the offer, but I need to ensure that accepting it won't put my children at risk. They've sacrificed 12 years of stability because of my decision to expose corruption. Dr. Hayes arranged for security consultation and legal protection review to address Isabella's safety concerns. The hospital's legal team contacted federal authorities who had been investigating international medical fraud cases, discovering that the Colombian corruption that had forced Isabella's exile was part of a larger pattern that had been under federal investigation. Dr. Rodriguez, the investigation that destroyed your career in Colombia has been reopened by international authorities, Dr. Hayes informed her. Evidence has emerged that supports your original allegations about equipment tampering and administrative corruption. Isabella felt 12 years of exile and silence begin to lift as the truth about her case finally received the investigation it had deserved. Dr. Hayes, if the charges against me are cleared, and if my children's safety can be ensured, I would be honored to return to pediatric cardiac surgery. Emma's parents were informed about the extraordinary circumstances surrounding their daughter's surgery and the remarkable identity of the woman who had saved her life. Their gratitude toward Isabella was combined with amazement that one of the world's leading pediatric surgeons had been working in the hospital cafeteria while their daughter received treatment. Dr. Rodriguez, Emma's mother, said through tears, "How can we ever thank you for giving our daughter her life back?" Isabella smiled with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had finally been able to use her skills for their intended purpose. By watching her grow up healthy and strong, that's all the thanks any surgeon ever needs. 6 months later, Dr. Isabella Rodriguez stood in OR 3 wearing surgical scrubs that bore her real name for the first time in 12 years. The international investigation had cleared her of all charges related to the Colombian hospital deaths, confirming that equipment tampering by cartel-connected administrators had caused the patient fatalities that had been blamed on her surgical techniques. Her reinstatement to active surgery had been expedited through cooperation between Children's Medical Center, international medical organizations, and federal authorities who recognized her expertise as a valuable asset in treating complex pediatric cardiac conditions. Her first official surgery was the repair of a congenital heart condition similar to Emma's, but performed under her own authority rather than as guidance to another surgeon. Emma Chen, now 8 months post-surgery, had returned to normal childhood activities with cardiac function that exceeded what anyone had expected from her repair. Her case had become a teaching example for the innovative surgical techniques that Dr. Rodriguez had developed during her years of practice in South America. The cafeteria at Children's Medical Center had been reorganized without Isabella's daily presence, but her former co-worker remained amazed by the revelation that the quiet woman who had served their meals was one of the world's most accomplished pediatric surgeons. Her story had spread throughout the hospital as an example of how extraordinary expertise could be hidden in the most ordinary circumstances. Dr. Matthews had requested assignment to Dr. Rodriguez's surgical team, recognizing that working with her provided learning opportunities that exceeded what traditional fellowship programs could offer. His experience with Emma's surgery had taught him that surgical expertise could come from unexpected sources and that questioning assumptions about credentials and authority could lead to better patient outcomes. Isabella's children had adapted to their mother's return to surgery with pride that replaced the years of uncertainty about their family's future. Maria had been accepted into medical school with plans to follow her mother's path into pediatric cardiac surgery, while Carlos had maintained his interest in engineering but gained new appreciation for the medical expertise that had defined their family's journey. The Colombian medical authorities who had originally stripped Isabella's license had been replaced through investigations that revealed the extent of cartel influence in hospital administration. Her case had become a symbol of international efforts to protect healthcare professionals who exposed corruption that endangered patient safety. Dr. Rodriguez's return to surgery had attracted patients from across North America who needed the specialized expertise she provided for complex congenital heart conditions. Her techniques, refined through years of experience and research, continued to advance the field of pediatric cardiac surgery while providing hope for families facing devastating diagnoses. But perhaps the most significant change was Isabella's own sense of completion after 12 years of exile from the work that had defined her purpose. Every successful surgery represented not just medical achievement, but personal redemption for someone who had never stopped being a surgeon, despite wearing a cafeteria uniform. Her office at Children's Medical Center displayed both her medical credentials and a photo from her cafeteria days, reminding visitors that expertise often exists in unexpected places and that the most valuable knowledge is sometimes carried by people who appear to be ordinary service workers. The hospital's new employee orientation now included Isabella's story as an example of how assumptions about credentials and authority could prevent recognition of extraordinary expertise. Her experience demonstrated that the most capable people are often those who don't announce their abilities, but simply perform their duties with quiet competence. And that's what Hidden Valor Stories is all about. Discovering that the person serving your lunch might be the expert you need most, that extraordinary knowledge often wears ordinary uniforms, and that the most valuable skills are sometimes carried by people who have learned to hide their capabilities while waiting for the moment when silence becomes impossible. Dr. Isabella Rodriguez proved that 12 years of exile couldn't diminish expertise that had been earned through decades of saving children's lives. Her story reminds us that hidden among the people we barely notice are individuals whose knowledge could change everything if we were wise enough to recognize their value. The surgical team, who had dismissed her as just the cafeteria worker, learned that expertise doesn't always wear the credentials we expect, and that the most accomplished professionals are often those who have learned humility through circumstances that tested everything they thought they knew about their own identity. Sometimes saving a life requires recognizing that the person you've been overlooking possesses exactly the knowledge you need most. And sometimes the greatest experts are the ones who never stopped being experts, even when the world forced them to pretend they were something else entirely. So the next time you encounter someone whose knowledge seems to exceed what their position should require, remember Dr. Isabella Rodriguez and consider that you might be meeting someone extraordinary who has learned to hide their expertise until the moment when staying silent would mean watching someone die. Because hidden among us are people whose stories we've never heard and whose capabilities we've never recognized, but who carry within them the power to change everything if we're brave enough to listen when they finally speak.